Great, thank you. So we wanted to talk about the infrastructure as a service. We're finding out a lot about what our biggest and brightest, most forward-thinking customers are working on, and in most cases, it's new projects that are moving to cloud-based infrastructure. Obviously, it's a lot lesser expensive to operate new equipment, new software projects out on top of infrastructure as a service. I find a lot of cases, one of the projects that tends to move quickest are things that are centered on top of Hadoop or big data-based systems, just because the vast number of computers required in those kinds of compute clusters. Most organizations that get started with Hadoop-based systems tend to build out pretty large, expensive compute infrastructure. And when you start looking at the price of hundreds to thousands of nodes in a cluster, that starts looking like a very large number, which drives looking at moving things out to infrastructure as a service, just because the cost to ask for another 100 computers or 1,000 computers is fairly small, and at a moment's notice you can turn those things off. So there's quite a bit of automation that's built into that. So return on investment seems to be pretty good with moving things out to infrastructure as a service, but I think where we get called in is usually when it moves from the development phase over into the operations or production phase, as people end up looking into how to secure and how to manage access to those systems. And that's really where we've been spending a lot of our time working with customers to come up with best practices as far as how to secure and manage those systems. Before we dive into those areas, cover a few more slides and show you how those things work, but maybe we should hear from you on what you're finding with your customers.
Yeah, so one of the things that we find with our customers is, I'll just take you back probably 2 years ago. 2 years ago, when I used to say within our A&D space or within our government clients and stuff too, consideration of infrastructure as a service, it was almost that Ghostbusters sign with the circle and the no, we're not going in that direction. And to that, there was a lot of credit because, again, it comes down to this is my system, I own this system, I'm responsible for it, I'm culpable for it, that's there. But as we start looking, we start seeing both the convergence of our government practice space as well as the new concentration, as well as including Silicon Valley now into this space too, to further the road along, in which we have convergence of both security as well as capability. That story has to change. It will change, and it has to change from both the cost benefit, from a cost benefit standpoint, return on investment standpoint, but also as far as in sharing the space from a security standpoint. Collectively as a community, both in government, contractor, third party, even the nation states or so that we're working with, this has to be really a converged type of effort that's out there in which we're increasing capability to provide and serve both on the military side as well as from a corporate side, but also to be able to continue to move the meter forward, because our adversaries in general are also moving that meter forward and what they can do in their capability, and together is much better than individually as far as trying to move that meter forward by ourselves, both from a cost standpoint and a talent standpoint. We talked about workforce and stuff, and the divergence of workforce as far as the turnover that we get, especially when you have a good resource. Each and every one of you probably in this room has had that story where you had a great resource, they left, you've got a big hole there now, right? So looking at the opportunity from infrastructure as a service that's there has become a viable option, because not only are you starting to see if you can centralize some of that corporate capability, but also you're able to start leveraging innovations in that area. And that's innovations both on the production side and the security side. And that's a story that's starting to become more and more prevalent within our client base. And in particular, as we go and further into a regulatory environment or compliance environment as well. And then also when we talk about advanced persistent threats and stuff too, being able to start level setting that and be able to start controlling the cost and growth within that area while still getting the same level of innovation.
Yeah, I definitely hear from a lot of our accounts talking a lot about security and concerned about how to secure those systems once they move out to cloud-based infrastructures, just because they're not in your traditional data center, right? You can't physically see the servers, you can't get your hands on it, it's not behind the same kind of protections. So you're basically trusting that Amazon, Google or Azure, Microsoft are doing that kind of protection around the physical data center. And that's why we saw a lot of push towards FedRAMP and that effort to try to standardize the security around managing those systems as they're running out at the infrastructure as a service provider. Now Amazon has come up with this shared responsibility model that they promote that basically shows the things that they're responsible for at the infrastructure layer. They're going to provide the data center, the computers, the networking infrastructure around that, protections and operations. They'll also make sure that they have systems set up in HA, things like that they're doing for compute and storage and network. But on top of that, you're responsible for running and operating the applications, protecting your data, controlling who can gain access to that infrastructure. They have management tools, and you're responsible for maintaining and managing who can access that management platform, the AWS console, the Azure console, et cetera. And in all cases, there's ways to deploy that in such a way that we can tie that back to the enterprise. We look at it in sort of three different areas. One area is centered around the infrastructure as a service management platform. So we'll first tie that back to your enterprise and enable smart card-based authentication to a portal that then lets you click on a link to get to the AWS console. That's nice in that it ties back to your AD infrastructure, the master user record that was dictated by a CDM. And now that we have the ability to tie that back into your Active Directory infrastructure for smart card authentication, you have the ability to control what role does the user get when he tries to log on to the AWS console. Now that's going to control exactly what rights he has. Can he create a new server, which costs money, or can he kill a server that might be serving a valuable purpose? And so you have controls over setting up roles and rights for those people that govern what exactly they can do inside those management platforms. But aside from that, once you spin up new virtual machines inside Amazon or Azure or Google, you're also responsible for how to control login to the operating system. What IT staff should gain access, what their rights are with privilege management, and which end users can gain access to the applications. I find that most organizations adopt a model that extends the reach of your Active Directory to those new systems, either by setting up a new resource forest or the one-way trust back to the on-premises is typical that most people adopt. That actually still supports smart card-based authentication, just because the users are still going to be required to authenticate at their desk with a PIV card, CAT card. From there, they can gain access to those servers using standard remote access tools. And the applications can still be supported in the same fashion using stronger SAML-based assertions or other WSFED or other token technologies, OpenID Connect, et cetera. So using these new technologies, there's a way to basically extend the traditional data center reach out to these new systems running in Amazon, making it a whole lot easier to centralize management and adhere to programs like CDM and enable use of that same technology out on these new machines that might be running within infrastructure.
Now, when you look at, David, when you look at some of the areas as far as for identity and lifecycle management, one of the things that I find that that's in industry is that we tend to go the easiest route, and that is, can I find a tool that does it all for me? Now, when you guys are working with your client customer base and stuff that's out there right now, what are some of the challenges as far as getting the understanding as far as for infrastructure as service, what they are really able to leverage? Is there a lot of variety as far as on how they do identity lifecycle management within that? Do they have options across the board as far as where you've got hybrid or if you have fully outsourced infrastructure as a service as well? Tell us a little bit about that.
Right, so a lot of the lifecycle management is centered around automation tools, specifically around the computers themselves, because they spin up and they get a new identity. Inside the infrastructure, most computers spin up and then join Active Directory, especially if they're Windows computers. That was actually the goal of CDM phase one is to get all the rest of the computers integrated into Active Directory. Sorry, that was phase two. Phase one was discovery. But we do the exact same things when you're in an infrastructure as a service environment. The most important aspect is integrating into whichever orchestration tool you've chosen to use. Orchestration tools are designed to help you manage creating machines and deleting machines. And those are important because in a lot of cases, these applications are being reconstructed to be more dynamic, more elastic. In other words, if you're setting up a website that's going to service citizens and have them connect in and access that site, you want it to be dynamic so that as you start seeing load, you add more servers to the pool of computers that can service the request. And then when this workload dies down, you can start deleting, killing off machines that are no longer needed to reduce your bill. Because it's not like you bought a machine and you just have to use it. These are, you pay by the hour. And so integrating into the orchestration systems, we found ways to make that tied back into management of the software that runs on the machine that controls who can log in, what their rights are. So it's more about life cycle of the computer and managing access permissions and centralizing the access permissions inside a directory. The human lifecycle management is going to leverage everything that you've already done on premises, taking advantage of other tools and components you may already have.
Okay. No, that's one of the probably the best points there. I know, since 2010, 2011 or so, one of the things that we did a lot of was a lot of integration of existing IAM environments on premise in this case. So tools from different vendors or so, in some cases multiple vendors depending on how folks broke up their environment, whether federal or commercial. And now with the advent of different regulations, DFARS 252.204-7012, items like that in which we start talking about NIST 800-171 controls, and we're looking at a lot of companies right now who have acquired over the years. They've been doing acquisitions over the years, and the thing is that in those acquisitions, they've tried to stay streamlined or they've tried to maintain the capability to produce and continue to serve their client. So looking at those types of infrastructures and going, well, what next? We now have 5 or so acquisitions that are operating independently, but no true fidelity or no true federation of identity and access management there. Tell me about some of the keys and stuff that you see in the industry for infrastructure as a service as a viable option for those.
Yeah, that's centered around identity management. As organizations have multiple acquisitions, or they may be expanding out to additional infrastructure as a service as an alternative to data centers, or maybe as an augmentation to the existing data centers. It's all about centralization. And while within the boundaries of an organization, it's easy to centralize within a directory, certainly as you start extending outside, you need other tooling like identity as a service type offerings that enable the extension of the identities that you have on-prem to those things that might be running outside. A good example is how do you hook up, grant your employees access to Office 365. You're going to need to extend your Active Directory on premises to that hosted application. If you're going to be moving an application that's running on servers on premises to your data center, you're going to need to do the same kinds of things. Setting up federated-based authentication is the easiest way to do that, given that there's tooling and infrastructure available through identity as a service offerings like ours. We have one that enables the connection to one or more Active Directories on-prem or LDAP servers and enables to authenticate the users that are on premises, again, using smart card to get to the portals, and then from there, click on a link that generates security tokens that grants the access to the application. Whether that's the infrastructure as a service management platform for IT staff, or if it's a business application that your employees need to gain access to, that they can all get to that through the same interface. Again, the key is to make sure that it supports strong authentication and or multi-factor if necessary, above and beyond just the CAT card, PIV card authentication. If you want to really verify that it's the right person, push notification out to the mobile phone, things like that can be added as augments to the solution set.
Okay. Mergers and acquisitions, always a big topic as far as in our industry. Whenever we have any type of economic or geopolitical or political changes and stuff too, mergers and acquisitions becomes one of those things that really brings in a lot of complications, especially if you've got this somewhat double-digit billion-dollar company merging with this somewhat double-digit billion-dollar company as well. And with those, you've got these inrooted capabilities, whether it be data center applications that are used, and then depending on how that business was went prior, even sometimes contract by contract infrastructure to be able to take in and swallow, with also the ability to continue to defend against advanced persistent threats that are out there. Now, with infrastructure as a service as a tool, how would you describe it as a tool within that type of environment?
Yeah, so infrastructure as a service does make it easier to set up and deploy a net new application or run new projects independent of the organization hosting the application or the one that's going to run that. So if the organization or agency needs to share data with another agency, it's easier to use federated authentication technologies to gain access to those applications or the servers and tie it into multiple agencies for the authentication. The identity as a service offerings tend to provide business-to-business SAML-based federation. That means that we're going to trust each agency to authenticate the end users with their smart cards, generate tokens that are valid at the application side of things, typically called service provider, that then grants the access to the application. I find a lot of, we've been working with another large company that built out an application specifically for federal, and then they came to us saying, we need to be able to support many different agencies accessing the application, and by the way, we need smart card authentication. And at that point, it was very easy to go back and show them a way to tie it to this identity as a service offering and support the federation to the other agencies. In other words, let the agency do the SAML-based authentication of the employees, generate a SAML token, and at that point, we could then trust that SAML token that had been authenticated by the agency in order to grant the access to the application. And that then facilitated sharing of information across the agencies, because then you could enable various groups of people across different agencies the rights to gain access to this application and the data that it holds. I think another challenge that people face is providing mobile-based access to the same applications. And a lot of times these are new applications that are being built that run on infrastructure as a service. And if you're building out a new application, you typically think about where is the user going to gain access to the app? Is it a browser or is it going to be a mobile device? And in the mobile device scenarios, we tend to find that derived credential becomes most important, especially in the federal space where CAC and PIV card is required. We can then use the mobile device as a way to auto-issue, based on request, a derived credential from the fact that you authenticated with your smart card on your desktop and grant that credential on the mobile device. And again, that's going to tie into the same identity as a service offering so that once you've got that derived credential on mobile, you're going to see the same portal, the authentication's handled based on the derived credential, and from there you'll still be able to click on the link and get to the application. The application just simply has to enforce that it requires the identity as a service offering to do the validation of who the user is.
Yeah.
Set up the access controls.
Yeah, one of the areas as far as in my practice has been in the identity and access management, of course, but also the broader governance and risk compliance area for Deloitte. One of the primary goals of that is looking at how we tie in that governance capability, for entire enterprises. Sometimes, again, those enterprises are disparate. And it's a matter of how do we converge that. And typically there's no lack of argument or no lack of discussion among both the technical leaders of those organizations as well as your strategic leaders of those organizations. There's always a very interesting comment that's there, and that is, I want to guard my area, I want to guard my area, and I want to guard my area. So trying to break into that particular, into those particular enterprises is the first complication. The second complication then is to work with the culture and stuff too on that change. Typically, if you have an entrenched data management or IT department or so that's been there for years and years and years, they have ownership, which is great ownership of that. And one of the things that we try to look at is how do we retain that ownership as we go through those transitions, as well as continue to protect and get viable solutions out as quickly as possible to tie it together. Privileged access management is one of those areas. Basically, who is going to have the keys to the kingdom? And then the other part is once they have the keys to the kingdom, how do we continue to manage that going to the infrastructure as a service? And also, how do we continue to attest to that from from the providers that are there. Typically, trying to get that information has always been key. Are they a FedRAMP, or is that a FedRAMP, or is that a FedRAMP certified type of organization? Are they working with NIST? What have you found as far as with like AWS and a number of the others? How are they addressing that?
Again, back to Amazon's model of shared responsibility. Microsoft and Google also have, and the other hosting providers, they all have a similar model where they take responsibility and they own and manage the data center and the computers and the network. They attest to that and have FedRAMP certifications. So there are GovCloud that Amazon operates. Microsoft has FedRAMP certification for their data centers. Most all of them, they want to obviously gain the trust of the IT staff in order to facilitate the migration of these applications from on-premises to the cloud, and have to prove that within their back-end data centers and infrastructure. They do provide a lot of controls that enable the organization to be able to manage the privileges, and which users are gain privileges based on their role that they provide in the organization. And that can be very, very granular, down to your rights to access particular parts of the AWS environment or the Azure environment with respect to, can you create a computer, can you delete computers, can you create a new network, or because they've automated everything within the data center so that it's all software. In fact, you can go back and write scripts that do all of this stuff, but it all ties back to an identity and access management system that both Amazon, Azure, and Google all provide as the base layer that needs to be tied into the enterprise. We provide that glue to tie their identity and access management systems into the enterprise to enable Active Directory users the rights to log into these consoles and to perform the duties that are appropriate for that particular person. However, with the virtual machines, it's a little bit different, right? When you go in and create a virtual machine, you're sort of on your own. You need to manage all of that yourself. And that's where we provide guidance to our customers on how to extend the existing on-premises management platform out to the servers. But I also find auditing the activity is extremely important to give that kind of visibility that you'd want to bring back to a dashboard like in the CDM environment. And again, the tools are really not much different. There are additional capabilities that the hosting providers have with respect to gathering the audit trails out of the API calls and the infrastructure that the Amazon or Microsoft are hosting for you. But then again, the virtual machines, you'll manage those the same way you manage those when you're managing servers on premises. They'll be operated in the same fashion.
Okay. I think we have 2 minutes left. Is that correct?
Any questions?
Any questions? Anybody in a coma after that great lunch?
No, I don't. I've looked into blockchain, but I don't see how it applies, to this particular technology space yet.
Yeah, from my end, I do not have a great insight on blockchain. Yeah.
Is there another question?
How ready is infrastructure as a service for industrial control systems or mission-critical life safety environments?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think a lot of people struggle with how ready is infrastructure as a service for real-world use. I think the best proof of that is a lot of the, certainly there's a lot of .com companies that have adopted cloud services, but as we've started working with a lot of our biggest organizations, both within federal as well as in commercial, we're starting to find those biggest organizations move their most sensitive and largest applications to infrastructure as a service. And part of that migration process, we actually operate an application as a service on top of infrastructure as a service today. We use Azure and moving to support also AWS. And part of that migration from an application that's on-prem to hosted involves looking at the application and seeing how you can take advantage of a lot of the features they offer. Because they do have, within a single data center, availability zones. They also have regions and have the ability to set up load balancers that will balance the load from one region to another region. So that would give you East Coast, West Coast fault tolerance within an application. Obviously, the application needs to be redesigned a little bit in order to take advantage of those kinds of capability. And the infrastructure providers have done the same thing at storage layers, so that if you write something to storage, it can be replicated automatically to various regions to provide the redundancy in the data itself. Obviously, at that point, you're responsible for making sure you're doing a good job of encrypting the data because you want to control the keys that access that data set. But there is that looking into the application to figure out exactly how you would migrate the app and provide better availability of the service so that it is fault tolerant and provide the kind of availability you expect for the app.
Yeah, for some of the critical infrastructure and stuff too, as far as in like power and utilities and a number of the other areas for CIP and NERC and stuff. When we look at the infrastructure as a service, I would say most folks are still really in the evaluation phase of that. That's there. We still have some prohibitive areas within, within the regulations and within the controls and stuff you're supposed to implement for that. That I won't say uniquely disqualify it, but it does complicate the discussion, does complicate the conversation. And I would say when we work in that type of environment, it is really a close relationship with the regulatory body or whomever that we're working with to do that type of implementation. But for the most part, working with folks like working with some of the other foundations and other third-party organizations in that area that the industry is combined with and make consortiums, that topic is becoming more and more prevalent, and it's pushing further and further, especially as we move, especially in the P&U and critical infrastructure discussion, as we move to SIP 6 and those areas. That's starting to become a little bit more advisable too, as far as on how do you do that when you get into topics like smart grid and a number of other areas too. All right, guys, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for the time.